I'm reading this really great book that a friend of mine in Chicago, who's a collector of old books, gave me. So Ben Hecht wrote it in 1943, called A Guide to the Bedeviled. Which is a guide to the bedeviled. I'm assuming that it's out of print, but you can look it up and can demand that it get back into print because it's an awesome book. But I was just reading on the plane today. I can't remember, it's Pinto, I think his name was. He was talking about Voltaire and how Voltaire's anti-Semitism was more destructive than Nazi anti-Semitism because it gave the intellectual writ for hatred of Jews. And so he's going through this, and then he says that in France, in Marseille, I think it was, there was this Jew from Portugal in 1763 by the name, I think, of Pinto, who was very angry at Voltaire's anti-Semitism. And he wrote a letter to Voltaire. All the Portuguese Jewish emigres, of course, had been thrown out of Portugal in 1492, but they all were living and very prosperous in France, in this community. And so this Portuguese Jew wrote to Voltaire saying, "How dare you cast aspersions on the Jews? Now, I understand why you would think that of the German and Russian Jews, but we here in Marseille, right, we're just like you. There's no difference. We hate the Russian Jews and the German Jews just as much as you do," he told Voltaire. "But don't make it into a collective." Right? And what was interesting that I didn't know, as Ben Hecht said, was that very shortly thereafter, the French said, "Wait a minute, there are prosperous Jews here?" They took away all of their money, they took away all of their property, and they reduced them to the same penury as their hated brethren, who they hated, in Russia and in Germany. Because there's this constant notion, right, that has accompanied us through time. And so I'm reading this on the plane. And probably the people sitting around there probably all thought I was crazy because I was going, this woman is grunting like a horse. But, the point is just that, this has been going on through time, where we've had apostate Jews on one level or another who have been trying to get out from under the burden of being Jews by turning on other Jews and saying, look, we agree, it's their fault. I mean, we see so much of the finger pointing at religious Zionists, right? This has been going on actually since the time of Mendelssohn in Germany in the 19th century. Ostjuden, the revenge of the Ostjuden, that's what I say. Stop it already. Enough of this nonsense. Enough of this nonsense. But no. They say it's not us, it's the religious Jews, it's the religious Zionists. They're the problem. They're the problem. And we see it among the Israeli left. That you've had, in a way, the whole peace process, the whole concept of an occupation and of embracing the PLO, for crying out loud, the architects of modern terrorism as legitimate, is really an internal Jewish, I would say, rivalry, only it's only one side that views itself as locked in battle with the other of the secular Jews, not all of them, of course, but of this elite sect who feels like they're being undermined by religious Jews who reject their attempt to integrate into Europe, which, was taking baths in Jewish blood just a couple generations ago. So, this is something that has been going along across time and, from time immemorial, and I don't think that we'll ever get over it. Yes. So let me just take your last point first. Okay. Do we need to do anything? Anything? Why is it on us? It's not on us to solve the solution. I mean, we have to do our best to secure Israel's interests and prosperity, national security, and then dump the whole problem on our kids, right? That's it. That's our job, right? We have to carry it on through our generation and then leave it to somebody else to pick up the rest. No. We have to do our best. We have to do our best. Between you, me, and the lamppost, I didn't like the name of my book, but what can I do? It was Random House's decision. I gave them 7 different titles. None of them had the word solution in them, but they came up with this one, and they got to decide, and so that was that. However, be that as it may, And in fact, in my book, when you read it, of course, you'll see that I never actually call it the Israeli solution. I call it the Israeli one-state plan. And the solution was put on afterwards in the editing process, and I purposely never changed it in the text because I didn't like the term. Be that as it may, it's the name of my book, so I'm dealing with it. But is it a viable option? Is it a good idea? Why won't we become like Europe? Well, only if we're like the Europeans. And I think that one of the things that we see, and I don't think we will, I think we're in fact diverging very sharply from the rest of the West today, and I think the best illustration of that really is the fertility rates. Because Israelis are actually becoming, I made Aliyah in 1991, and I have been living through a transformation of Israeli society. I mean, when I came there, Israel was having convulsions. We were absorbing over 1 million new immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and then another several tens of thousands from Ethiopia, that had a completely different way of looking at the world than the old-time Israelis, the native-born Israelis. And when I got to Israel, I mean, I tell you, it was not a happy place. Everybody hated one another. I was a lone soldier. I made Aliyah by myself. I was 21, so everybody just sort of looked at me as their personal Wailing Wall, and everybody told me how much they hated everybody else. That was really a very early and formative experience that I had when I first made Aliyah. There was so much discontent, there was so much bitterness, there was so much feeling like everything was coming undone, because in a way, it was. But I mean, having that kind of convulsion in a country that had, scratching up to 4 million Jews, suddenly bringing in 1.1 million, and from Russia with such a different way of life, was really a huge shock to the system of the country. But today, how many years later? 23 years later, I mean, Avigdor Lieberman is bringing in all of these native Israelis into his parties because nobody's voting for Russian parties anymore. They don't have any real hold because the Russians who made Aliyah in the late 80s and the 90s are Israelis. And they don't consider themselves to be Russians. They consider themselves to be Israelis. They're not distinct. Israel has changed because of them. We've changed from an economic perspective. We've changed from a social perspective. We've changed from an intellectual perspective. We've changed on so many different levels. And we've changed from a religious perspective as well. Israel is a much more religious country. And I don't mean simply more religious people. When I made Aliyah, I went into the Army, and they gave me an officer's rank because I had a BA immediately even before I went to officer training course. And so I was the on-duty officer at my base, like 3 weeks basically after I got out of basic training. And I was on this base that had this agricultural college in it. And they had brought over this delegation of Africans for the weekend, and they asked me, or for some agricultural program, they asked me if my soldiers would do a Kabbalat Shabbat for them. I said, sure, what the heck, you're eating dinner. And I asked one of my soldiers to do the blessing on the candles. She didn't know it. I mean, there was such an ignorance of Jewish traditions among so many secular Israelis, and today it's just not true. I can't imagine that if I were in a similar situation today, I would be beset by for me, what was very shocking, a situation where an Israeli girl soldier didn't know how to do the most basic blessing that we learned when we were nothing. And so this doesn't happen anymore. Today, you have more and more religious education inside of secular Jewish Israeli curricula in schools. You have so much more of an integrated view of Jewish identity and Israeli identity than you had in 1991. And all of this is just a long way of saying that, when you look at London, when you look at Europe in general, when you look at Britain in particular, or France in particular, you can look at it from the perspective of Melanie Phillips, who wrote it in Londonistan, and then in her later books about the absence of the abandonment of reason by the world, or in David Goldman's book about why civilizations collapse and why Islam is collapsing as well, that, what Melanie said was, these Muslims who are coming to Britain are facing a Britain that doesn't know what Britain is. You have levels of alcoholism, broken families that are unprecedented. That children are growing up with absolutely no idea that they are the scions of one of the greatest civilizations in world history. They don't know anything, and to the extent that they've learned anything, they've learned that Britain is evil and it's a culture of dead white men who wanted to oppress others. So, and this is to the extent they know anything. Most of them, according to her, don't know anything. And so if you're a Muslim immigrant from Pakistan or anywhere else searching for meaning in your life, the British have nothing to offer you. On the other hand, the imam in your mosque is really excited about this concept of jihad, and he is inspiring. The teachers who aren't allowed to say anything anymore in public schools about the greatness of Britain, lest they be considered bigoted, have nothing to offer you. The same goes for city after city in Europe, because, what you see really is that after World War II, Europe to a certain degree just committed suicide itself. It just lost interest. They tried that whole nationalism thing and it led them to Auschwitz. So you know what, never mind. Let's just forget about the whole thing. And that's what we're seeing in country after country. And when you look at the sociological, you have to look at what's happening inside of a society to understand how it reacts to challenges. And that's why I seem to be digressing by giving this conversation, but I'm not. Because what Martin does is he says, because this happens in Sweden, it's going to happen in Israel. But the exact opposite trend is occurring in Israel. So, you can say, well, that's not important. It doesn't matter that it's occurring in Israel. But I say it is important that it's occurring in Israel because it means something about how we respond. It means something about what we have to offer. What do we have to offer them? Without even offering them anything. Just by being who we are. What is that light? What is that example that we're setting? We are being an Or LaGoyim, just because we're coming into our own. It took 3 generations, but it's happening, thank God, in Israel today. And so I think that it's important to look at it that way. In terms of the viability of other options, look, it's like the reason why I think that the Palestinians are emigrating. And that's fabulous. And if you want to, whatever, they're leaving Israel. If they want to go to Marseille, if they want to go to Doha, if they want to go wherever they want to go, nobody should be making it difficult for them to leave. But I don't think that you help matters when you offer them money to renounce their rights. I think that it's just a normal human response to things like that. When does somebody become a Jew, right? You become a Jew when you're singled out because your last name is Cohen, right? If you're an assimilated Jew, you wake up to the knowledge that you are a Jew and a part of Jewish history when somebody singles you out as such. So if you were to say to somebody who lives in Betunia, look, I'll give you $100,000 if you leave and renounce your rights, I'm just putting myself in their shoes, I would say, well, go to hell. Don't you tell me what I can and cannot do. I think that the psychological response to that is normal. It's human. And when you're dealing with normal human impulses, then you can extrapolate what one action will cause in response. And that's why I think, personally, I think that it's a non-viable option. Do they want to leave in theory? Yes. Are they leaving in practice? Yes. If Israel encourages them to do so, will it stop? I think so. So that's why I don't think that it's viable. I don't think that the trends are going to stop. But I do think, and I don't think that they're going to abate. I think that they'll probably rise because, it's like you got an uncle, right, living in Berlin, and he's writing back home and saying, gee, things are fabulous here, then you're going to want to go join him because that's just the nature of migrations, right, not just of every people. So if this is happening, it's going to continue to happen. It's just a matter of course. Over 1 million people, 1 million Palestinians have told pollsters that if they had the opportunity, they would leave. That's 1 in 3. or 1 in 3.5. That's an enormous number. So are there other viable options? I don't think so. I weighed them. I came to this conclusion. I could be right. I could be wrong. Read the book and make your own judgment. But I think it's important to have this conversation. Yes, yes, sir, in the back. Well, I think what's going to happen in Jenin is very similar to what's going to happen in, or what is happening in Bakr el-Gharbia inside of 1949 armistice lines, Israel, which is that if you break the law, you get arrested. If you are a member of a terrorist organization, you get arrested. If you plot terrorist assaults on Israel, you get arrested. If you're involved in anti-Semitic incitement and solicitation of murder, you get arrested. I mean, I think, that's what happens. If you throw rocks, you get arrested. And the welfare authorities come in and start talking to your parents. We have to understand something, which is that at the beginning of the Palestinian terror war in 2000, they did a poll of Israeli Arabs, and at that point the incitement that the PLO was involved in among Israeli Arabs was really red hot. And we had started getting these Nakba protests at University of Haifa beginning in May of 2000, before Camp David started, and we were having these violent protests of Israeli Arabs in the months ahead of this, and then we had the violent riots in October 2000 in the Arab quarters, where they were literally pogroms. They were taking Jews out of their cars on Highway 65 on Wadi Ara on the way to Tiberias from Tel Aviv, taking them out of their cars and beating them. Right? This is a pogrom. This is what the Israeli Arabs were doing. Jisr al-Zarqa, the Arabs there, which is on the coastal highway between Haifa and Tel Aviv, by Atlit, they threw boulders at an Israeli car driving along the highway, and they murdered the driver. Right? And these were pogroms. They were besetting Jews who lived in Nazrat Eilit, in Upper Nazareth, as well, with mobs of Israeli Arabs. So, I mean, it was bad for 10 days. And then the police took control of it, and that was it. When you look at the numbers, the rate of support for terrorism and the annihilation of Israel among the Israeli Arabs at that time, they were identical to the rates of support for terrorism and commitment to the annihilation of Israel among the Palestinians on the other side of the line in Judea and Samaria. So but the involvement of Israeli Arabs in terrorism was 1/10 of the level as the people just across the line in Judea and Samaria, 1/10. So what explains that? Well, what explains that is that they in the Galilee were living under Israeli sovereignty, where the only sovereign authorities were Israelis. And those in Jenin, just across the border, just a couple dozen, just a dozen or so kilometers away, were living under the rule of the PLO, where this kind of behavior was encouraged and financed and organized and directed and commanded by the regime. So when Israel is in control, the situation is a lot easier to deal with than it is when Israel is not. In the Palestinian uprising in the late 80s, began in 1988. Right, and sort of reached its height in 1990, and then it ended with the Gulf War in 91. Do you know what the most lethal weapon that the IDF used at that time to quell violence was? No, an M16. It was an M16, but that's it. That's it. I was in the Army in 91, and my friends who were soldiers with me at the time, they were wandering around Gaza City wearing, no vest, no nothing, just their gun. I hitchhiked. They forgot me, at a base in Gaza, and I ended up hitchhiking back to Tel Aviv by myself. They don't care. And it was fine. It wasn't fine. I wasn't happy about it. I was actually really upset about it. But, if you did that today, I'd be dead. Like that. There would be no Caroline to tell this story about, I was pretty mad about it. I was pretty dead about it. The situation was very different when you didn't have a PLO army, now trained by the US military. Again, I just can't let go of that, that was encouraging, engaging, and directing and financing terrorism against Israel. So if Israel has sole sovereignty over these areas, everybody was like, you're going to let them travel freely into Israel. Again, let us look at the distinction between levels of involvement in terrorism among Israeli Arabs and Palestinian Arabs, just across an imaginary line in the sand, which is no longer imaginary because you have a foreign army that is dedicated to the annihilation of your children is operating there. Right? You look at the difference and you see that where Israel is in charge, we don't have serious problems with terrorism. Where the PLO is in charge, we have very serious problems with terrorism. As to the whole peace industry thing, look, yeah, it would be really nice if it ended. Will it end? Maybe, maybe not. You've got billions of dollars and lots of very smart people who have dedicated their lives to, moving this on and on and on, like a hamster on a treadmill, right? So what? You know what? And we destroy the peace industry. Say tomorrow, we get this brilliant campaign going, and all of the Republican or the Republican Jewish money decides that it wants to go into this, and it actually works. Tomorrow there'll be something else. They'll figure out something else to be mad about, right? And to try to undermine the Jewish spirit with. So fine, let's just go on. We have our burdens. We'll bear them. What can you do? If you push this idea of rejecting reason out from Israel, out from the two-state thing, you end up with a situation where you have Jews at Harvard College writing in the Daily Crimson that academic freedom is overrated, and really what we have to have is tolerant. We have to make people feel comfortable, but only certain people, of course, feeling comfortable. The right people feeling comfortable. The wrong people should feel uncomfortable because they deserve to feel uncomfortable because we said that they're bad, and discussion is over. So when everybody knows what the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, it's the same ending of thought. And you asked a very good question. And I wrestle with it all the time. Glick, are you crazy? Is this really the right thing to do? And I go back and forth, and believe me, I don't want to get this wrong. And all I can think of is, this is just what we have to do. It's our land. We have to acknowledge that and embrace it, because if we don't, we'll lose it, and we just can't do that. So my book is based on facts. It's based on reason. It's an invitation to people like yourselves and to people who don't reason and don't want to think, to just sit back and think. Think, think, think. It's all about thinking. If we can just think, we can come up with ideas. Maybe mine isn't the best. It's the best I can think of. But I'm not the smartest person in the world. I just am one person. But if we all think, maybe we can come up with a better policy. That'd be great. I'd be happy. But let's just think about it. So thank you very much.